Okay, everybody, welcome back. Welcome to what should be the last week of lecture. I think by now you are probably mostly worried about your project, and I think that's probably the right thing. I guess the one thing on the admin side, sometime I guess later in the week from when this video will premiere, there's a project checkpoint due, which is not something with a huge criteria to it. It's really, we want to make sure you're working on your project, make sure you're getting some stuff done. So don't stress over that unless you haven't started your project, in which case, yes, stress over that. Otherwise, I'm going to give a lecture. So I'm going to, talk about something that I really haven't talked enough about in the course. I've talked about why before. And it's really because the server side's unavoidable. And I think much like, what was I complaining about a week or two ago? Tutorials for things with Docker containers forget you need a computer underneath them. Tutorials for client-side tools often forget you need a server. Right? There's no way around it. You need a server to serve your pages, but you also need a server for persistence and security, right? You can't check a password on the client side. It's not conceptually possible to do there. You have to do it where the logic is under your control. But of course, a lot of web programming is on the client side in the modern world. Some of you will have taken a course with Bobby Chan that might have been offered as special topics or whatever, that was much more focused on client side. Hopefully we're going to sort of rationalize these offerings very soon. But for the moment, I'll say a little bit, carry on from there. So in theory, if you sort of, look at the web spec, you can kind of use any language you want. And, you have a script element, you can kind of put anything you want in there. But of course, the browser has to run it. And there's basically one programming language that's supported by the web browser, and that's JavaScript. So it's probably what we're talking about here. The other option is something that's compiled to WebAssembly. WebAssembly is a funny name. Maybe web bytecode or something. It's a low-level representation in the same way that Java bytecode is a low-level representation of your logic, with the idea that you can compile a bunch of different things to it and run sort of faster than you would typically expect JavaScript code to run, although the just-in-time compilers in modern web browsers are shockingly good at running JavaScript very fast. So anyway, it's possible to have logic run in your web browser that was written in a programming language other than JavaScript. Or I guess maybe the other option I maybe should put in this list is or transpiled to JavaScript, something like TypeScript that turns itself into JavaScript, or something that turns itself into WebAssembly. But for the moment, for today, JavaScript. A lot of what I'm going to say is sort of equally applicable, but I'm going to just talk about JavaScript, because constantly saying JavaScript or WebAssembly or some other tool that compiles to JavaScript is too many syllables. Okay, so way back when I was talking about HTML and JavaScript, right, we had this browser compatibility problem where some stuff would work and some stuff wouldn't, and we didn't maybe always know what, and we had to be a little defensive in our code. It's possible to turn off JavaScript in a web browser. I feel like web developers forget this. And, what happens when Google indexes your page? It comes along to whatever page. If the page is built entirely with JavaScript, what does it see? I think it's well known that Google does now execute JavaScript somehow, but how? Are you comfortable with exactly what's going to happen there? There's weird browsers out there. There are speech browsers for people who can't see. There are smartwatch kind of devices. There's all of these ways that are not the standard browser that can access web pages. And again, I think often developers forget that they exist because of course you're developing at a computer with a big screen and all of the things that go with it. There are compatibility problems with JavaScript, and more so than like there's, again, I talked about it before. There are some compatibility problems with HTML, but very, very rare. Some compatibility problems with CSS, nothing too serious. They come up much more with JavaScript. I don't know. Oh, I know. Okay, can I use the JSON parsing handler thing that is built in JavaScript? It's at least a little bit new. Okay, yes. So IE8, yes. With some bugs or something. Well, that can't be good. Anyway. I don't know what else is in here that wasn't not like. This is one of those things, right? Like, I've been around a while. I know that array has been in JavaScript basically forever, so I would expect a lot of things. So yeah, like the basic array stuff. Yeah, you can just use it. It's fine. There's a lot of things that have been added, and maybe you can't use the .fill method or constructor or whatever it is. And then there's going to be stuff here that, again, has been added more recently in more recent JavaScript specifications. Weak map? Yeah. So, you know, can you use this? Maybe. Actually, one thing I didn't mention when I talked about it before, but one of the things that's actually pushing browser updates and sort of removing reliance on old browser compatibility is SSLs, well, TLS certificates. So the modern advice would be anything below TLS 1.2 is sort of questionable in its encryption. So this is the encryption for like HTTPS, right? So that encryption and certificates deal, and it's just not gonna work with anything less than IE11. Like I checked a few certificates around. Google.com is still an SSL3 certificate or SSL3 compatible, so it works pretty much anywhere. But increasingly, like if you're using the web with these sort of older browsers, it's just not going to work on a lot of sites. So like, I know I've talked about compatibility here and there, and I say, oh, you know, IE8, well, maybe. Well, also just maybe not, right? If you have a modern HTTPS setup, it was 1.1. Maybe those old browsers just disappear. But anyway, I'm dragging myself off topic. So a few notes about just how to use JavaScript, how JavaScript gets used. This should be the way that JavaScript gets integrated into your HTML. You can do this, I guess, right? You can put JavaScript code inline in HTML or in an HTML template, or you can just do this super janky, like super inline JavaScript URLs or JavaScript fragments. This style, I think, I understand why it occurs. Again, it occurs in tutorials because it makes the tutorial a paragraph shorter, right? It is a pain to introduce a tool or whatever and say, okay, well, in this file, put this code, and in this file, put this code, and then make sure they're in the same directory. And yeah, it takes a little bit more to say. It's easier to just say, here's what goes in the HTML file so you can get started and tuck the JavaScript in there. Makes the tutorial shorter, it makes the code worse. Here's why I'm going to assert that it does make the code worse. One of them is just style, right? I mean, having some HTML here and some HTML here and some JavaScript here, it's just harder to work with. It's harder to work with, again, just in this sort of text editor sense, right? That you're asking a lot of your syntax highlighter. I've certainly found this to be true in the past of just, hey, I have to fix some JavaScript. Some of it's in templates, some of it's in separate files, some of it's at the top in a script tag, some of it's in the bottom in a script tag. It can be really hard to work with. On the more technical side, I think I talked about content security policy earlier in the semester, but this is the header that says, like, okay, it's the in security, it's the mitigation for cross-site scripting, injection attacks. So what's being said by this header is script elements, or sorry, JavaScript, basically. JavaScript is allowed to be loaded from files on this domain or from apis.google.com. If I was starting a new website, absolutely, I would be sending this header. Again, it's easy to do the lazy thing once in a while, and if you have an existing project, it's hard to maybe retrofit. But absolutely, I would be sending this header for my project, and then if I decided I wanted other origins for JavaScript code, okay, we can add them in the header later. There again, if you allow inline code like this, you're not necessarily allowing cross-site scripting injection, but if it does happen, you're letting it cause damage. The hope is, if you have this, it's caught by the content. The injection is caught by the content security policy and mitigated, you hope. So you probably want that. It's probably the right thing to do for security, if nothing else. You then have this problem of, like, if you do have a script element like this, okay, so that's perfectly legal, or at least, if I finished my web page. What about this, right? So what if I want to do something like that? That's a perfectly valid string in this programming language. What's this? Is this inside the script element or not? I'm not sure. And I honestly would have to check in a browser. Like, you probably shouldn't do this, and you will see various things, like if you do end up needing to talk about that string in JavaScript, people end up doing this super janky stuff, because if it does end up inline, you don't want it to break everything. I just don't want it. I don't want to deal with that. The fact that in that context, a less than probably should be escaped. Like, probably I should be doing that. But then what is that? Does my string contain 1 character there or 4? I'm not. Geez, I actually don't know. Gross. As this JavaScript code, especially as it gets big, caching becomes a problem, right? It's one thing, again, to do this example with 2 lines of code, but if I have 100 lines of code there, it means every page that has that on it, and again, probably in our context, we're talking about a template here that is loaded from a bunch of different URLs, because we have every product page or whatever. And every one of those has that JavaScript fragment on it, and now my user has to download it every time they click on one of those pages. I don't want any of that. Don't be doing this. This is what you want, right? So some external JavaScript file where the rules are nice and clear and everything's going to be fine. Maybe, and again, a lot of those rules that I just said, they become a problem when there's a bunch of JavaScript code, certainly much more so. We're still going to have content security policy problems, but maybe this kind of thing is okay, where most of your JavaScript code is in a JavaScript file where it belongs, and then you've got a few things that are like setup, for lack of a better word, like just this local configuration of, like, I have this integer that I have to pass from my template or like from my server-side logic in towards JavaScript. So I'm going to sort of I guess do my own JavaScript injection there, like inject this integer in here as a variable and then pass it to a function. okay, well, we have to deal with this now, have this one-time key that the server understands and puts in the content security policy header, which is a thing. Right, so you have to have sort of this string that was generated and this header that you sent server to client. They have to match. That's not the end of the world. It's a little annoying to set up. It can be done, and you get 2 lines of code that aren't cached. I'll get over that. In the modern world, that's still not the right thing to do. There's a few ways to get around, like, again, injecting content from the server in towards your JavaScript code. So it might be something like this. So again, this is not JavaScript script, it's just data. It's a JSON blob, so it's not going to execute. The browser knows not to execute it. It's just JSON encoded data. Or maybe something like this, where you have you can insert an ID, a data element, sorry, data attribute on whatever element, wherever it makes sense, and you can say, well, okay, here's this integer, this one value or whatever, and you can then grab it, right? So find the body, get the ID, the data-ID value, or get this content, which is this, and then parse it into a data structure and use it. These are probably the correct way to do this. If you do have to, again, pass that data through to some JavaScript code and then read it when the time comes. So one of the things, and I snuck in on that last page, this sort of working with the document. So in some ways, JavaScript is just a programming language. In some ways, it's a really, at least client-side JavaScript is a really funny programming environment, because it lives inside this HTML document. Most programs are programs that, they run as a program on a computer. Client-side JavaScript is a program that runs in a web browser with your user or on your user's computer inside of a web page, which is weird. So the document object model isn't specific to client-side JavaScript or specific to JavaScript. It's more general. The things I'm about to say apply equally well to like a Python DOM module or Java DOM module or whatever. But these are the kind of operations you need to do on an HTML document or arbitrary XML document. One of the things I like about DOM is it's like it could be a Compute 225 assignment, right? Like, okay, we're going to have classes and objects and attributes and all of references and all of these things for an XML document. Okay, that's your assignment. Design one of these, and what you would design is pretty much DOM. It's, okay, well, we're going to have elements, the tags, and the tags have attributes and contents, and the contents is possibly a bunch of things, so it should be a list. You would design pretty much DOM if you were given that assignment. It is cross-language, like I said, different languages. Basically, there's just a syntax difference. All the sort of method calls and stuff are the same. But again, I'm talking about it in this client-side JavaScript context because what the sort of most important and obvious DOM object is the document, the page that we're in. And that's what you get. So just when you're writing JavaScript code, see, and I'm going to, no, I won't do it inline. So inside JavaScript code, you get this thing called document that is a DOM document object, one of these. And this is sort of where everything is going to get started. And you can do things like this. So document, again, predefined built-in thing in the web browser. So you can say, like, give me all of the paragraph tags, give me all of the things with class equals interesting, and you get back a basically list. Of course, it can't just be a list because it was designed at that time in the object-oriented programming history, where it's like, you can't override things on a list. You have to create a whole new data structure for this kind of data for whatever reason. But you get one of these back, and then of course all the properties and whatever else that go with it. This is probably my biggest annoyance with DOM, is that it's irritatingly verbose, right? Like, get elements by class name is a very long name for that method. Search class or something, or find class would have been much easier to spell and much fewer keystrokes. Get elements is perhaps not. Get elements by is in fact a very long prefix that I don't care about on that method name, but whatever. It is what it is. There's also this, and again, I think depending on your JavaScript history, like if you have written JavaScript before, how long you've been writing JavaScript, you might have gone through a phase, as I did, where this was just the way you had to do things. So if you wanted to find like all paragraph tags with class interesting, you have to sort of compose these two deals together and end up, I think this is legal. I think HTML collections also have this get elements by class name. You have to do that, and that's really annoying. Again, really verbose. At some point, in relatively distant history by now, but query selector all was added as a method. And does it work? Mostly. Partial. Okay. So, okay. Some relatively minor limitation on IE8. So sure. Probably just because of the CSS support it had. But basically the game you're playing here is you can now just give an arbitrary CSS selector. Of course, we all know CSS selectors. They're a very compact way to express parts of the page. Again, depending on your historical perspective, maybe you thought you needed jQuery for that. This is harder to spell. Document.querySelectorAll is harder to spell than $, which is the jQuery way to express that same thought. This might be faster. jQuery is probably just a call to query selector all at this point for almost everything it does. I find I have to stop myself. And again, maybe this is, again, if some of you are old school as well, I find myself just sort of using jQuery, importing jQuery out of habit. When I could have just, it's just this. I just have to spell $ that way instead. And I need to stop being old-fashioned in my JavaScript code, and maybe some of you do too. This is still a pain. All right, so if I want to like create a thing, so this is append a new, well, take this paragraph, put it at the end of the body. And again, jQuery way is very easy to spell. I don't think there's a better way in sort of pure JavaScript DOM to do this. I could be wrong. Again, maybe something has been snuck in I didn't notice, but this is okay. Give me the body element and create a new paragraph and put this text inside it, and then put the paragraph inside the body. I'd much rather write that, but I appreciate that I can write that. So again, this code, in fact, if I remove the word var there, the code that I'm looking at is JavaScript and Python and Ruby. I think all of them would accept that. Again, with that is JavaScript specific. So there is some there's some niceness to just knowing basic DOM manipulation. If you want to manipulate a document, deal with an XML document or whatever, in almost any programming language, you can get there. Your fingers will kind of know how to deal. I guess maybe one of the other reasons you might end up working with a document in JavaScript code is that it came from the server. And this is something that, again, was added at some point in the history of JavaScript. Just the ability to, from the browser, go back to the server and make a request with a whole bunch of footnotes on that, because if you allow the browser to make arbitrary HTTP requests, it means that like any like code injection on any website it can be a denial of service attack, because you can just say like, oh, hammer away at myenemy.com as fast as you can, because you can sort of inject that little bit of JavaScript in somebody else's site. So there's a rule there that's basically you can only request back to the same server, except with a cross-origin request sharing. I don't know. Again, like, some of you will have dealt with this. How do I say this? I've never been somehow dealing with cross-origin stuff. It does not spark joy. Like, I have never enjoyed my time trying to diagnose CORS problems. It can be done. Again, you can add this header that says, oh, hey, I am willing to accept requests from everywhere or from this domain. You can do it. It's a pain to set up, but you can do it. Okay, so let's say our JavaScript code can make an HTTP request at least back to our own server. So that means all of a sudden you have this interaction that without this fact wasn't possible. Again, interaction between the client and server. So again, I don't know if Ajax is still the going term for this. It's just sort of faded into the background as something everybody does. But you certainly will hear this collection of things called Ajax. It's another acronym that I hate because it only makes sense if you already know what it means. So asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Asynchronous is probably the important part here, in that without this, without JavaScript being able to make a request on its own, the only time you can interact with a server is when you do a page load. So if the user clicks a link, they go to a new URL, the page loads, obviously you can get data from the server at that moment. With this, okay, now we can do it with JavaScript. So that's the asynchronous part. We can, whenever we feel like running a line of JavaScript code, we can go back and ask the server for some information. We're doing it in JavaScript, but we're not using XML. Probably in the modern world, this data is coming as JSON encoded. It could be XML encoded. AJAX is a less cool sounding acronym, so I guess we'll stick with Ajax. The thing that makes this possible is the XML HTTP request object, which is hard to say and a lot of syllables, so XHR often. Doing this by hand isn't awesome. You end up, well, to make one request, we've got like 8 lines of code here. But this is, so set up the request making object. Say that when we get a resource loaded, we want to call this function. You could, of course, write this function inline as an anonymous function. Most JavaScript programmers would. I wouldn't. I like naming my functions. And then make a GET request to that URL. Sorry, set up a GET request to that URL, then send the request off. And then there is this non-blocking IO deal where whatever JavaScript code is below here will run. And then when the web browser decides it's time, when it has the data back, then we'll run the body of this function. And actually get the text and probably parse it as JSON. It always seems like there's like a couple lines of code too many here, but it's what you have to do. There's various helpers for it. There's a bunch of libraries that will, in various ways, wrap this up for you. Some of them at a little bit higher level, where it's just, I have a REST API on the server, please deal with it and set up my CRUD operations for me. Somewhere in the middle is the jQuery Ajax handling, which at least I find a little bit easier to spell. I don't care. Okay, JSON is handled automatically. That's great. When the thing comes back successfully, and I guess I have no error handling here, right? This is just when it's done, do this. If it was done and I got a 404 error, I don't know what's going on. Here I can say, well, success, do this, and then I can say error, do this other thing. much easier to deal with that. And again, logic there for what to do. Or again, you could have a named function here. I wrote it as an inline function. It's easier to spell in the tutorial, but maybe name your functions. So I guess as soon as you can go and make a request back to the server, a whole bunch of stuff sort of becomes possible. Even just something, again, that asynchronous update, just there's a new chat message or a new blog post or whatever, you can sort of update the page dynamically. The fundamental thing that's happening with frameworks like Vue and React, Angular, is this, which is, okay, we're getting a bunch of data as JSON objects from the server. Each one represents parts of the page. So when I get this data, put it in this template, draw that part of the page. Like fundamentally, that's what all these client-side templates are doing. Maybe it's just something as simple as you know, as a user is typing, autocomplete with like a possible address or username or whatever it is, something that has to go to the server for a database query, but we can offer that kind of thing. In general, like I'm sure some people here took 3D3 from me, where the final project in recent semesters has been create a thing that is a multi-language system. And so maybe there's calculations that just make more sense to do on the server because there's a Ruby library, or there's like, you've got to do this thing with C. It'll be faster if you write the C code to do it or whatever. So do part of the calculations there and sort of reformat them for display on the client side. All of these are sort of legitimate things to do. Again, communicating between server and client. The one thing I heard myself say back here actually was, okay, there's a new chat message. So, okay, well, what if I do want to do something like that is relatively real time? So I think the chat app is the most obvious thing here. If you have some kind of real-time-ish game, you want to know as soon as something happens, or sort of as soon as possible, that the other person in the chat has sent a message, those kinds of things. The sort of mismatch here is this operation is fundamentally the client asks the server, not the server sends to the client. So how do we get that to work? How do we get the server to send information to the client? The most obvious way, and the way that you would do with sort of no other addition of technology, is, well, pick a time interval, 5 seconds. Every 5 seconds, do the thing. Make a request to the server and say, oh, well, I need to know all the new chat messages, or send me any chat messages after this last one that I saw, or some request like that. It's fine. It'll work. There's a lot of requests happening. There's a lot of, like every time you make a request, you have those HTTP headers to send and receive. It's a lot of bytes to send, where most of the time the answer is going to be, nope, no new chat. So it'll work, but it's maybe not awesome. The thing that sort of became a stopgap in web history to have this work is long polling. Isn't there a diagram? Oh, I had a link to the wrong page. But the idea here is, instead of the usual interaction between client and server, so usually client makes a request and expects to get a response as soon as possible. In this, this interaction is the client says, okay, send me new chat messages whenever they arrive. And the server says, okay, please hold. And basically doesn't send the response yet, holds the connection. And when a chat message comes along, then sends that, closes the connection, finishes that response, and client can get it right away. Sort of as soon as the server feels like hanging up the connection and finishing its response, then the client gets the data. Okay, so that's good in that it's it's reasonably real time. As soon as the server feels like getting data to the client, it can finish its response. The problem is more sort of low-level technical now, that servers aren't generally very good at this. Something like Nginx is not designed with the idea that you're going to have 1,000 open connections. The idea is you open a connection and get it closed as soon as possible. It's just sort of baked into the design of the server. So if you're going to do this, okay, now we have to have all of these different threads holding open TCP connections. How many TCP connections are we allowed to have open? That's annoying too. But it'll work. The more realistic solution here, the more, again, like technically reasonable solution is, I don't want HTTP. Like, this isn't the protocol for this kind of interaction between a client and server. What I need is something much more like a socket from the networking course sort of sense. And this is what WebSockets are. There's a little example code here somewhere. Right, so I guess it's like connect to, like, not an HTTP endpoint, a WebSocket server, I suppose is what that stands for, endpoint. Then you can just do things like send, or where's the on, right. So when a message comes in, so if the server has something to send to me and the client, how am I going to handle it? Well, I'm going to handle it by calling this function. That's great. I mean, personally, like, I didn't get into web programming because I want to deal with sockets. Again, another piece of technology that personally does not spark joy. But again, this is the right thing to do. If you want to write a proper chat client, this is the right way to interact, where either side can send information as it needs to on a connection that is sort of set up for that kind of interaction. Great. Probably, and again, I think, can I use WebSockets? Yeah, yep, I can use WebSockets. Again, realistically, IE10, all edge, yeah, I could probably use WebSockets. So, okay, you can use them directly, or there's various libraries, Socket.io being the sort of granddaddy of them, that is a sort of higher level library that will connect with WebSockets. It will fall back to long polling or just straight polling if for some reason things aren't working, and it's a little higher level, a little easier to work with. On the server, we now have this other problem of all of the, I don't know, Rails code or Django code or whatever you've been writing on the server side has all been sort of shaped this way, which is, when a request comes in, what do I do? So the event that sort of triggered action was always an HTTP request. Now the event in question is going to be, this user over there said something in the chat room, and I have to send it to all of the users who need to receive it. That's a pretty just noticeable change in the programming style. Not the end of the world, obviously, but just different requirements from a framework. Different frameworks are better or worse at dealing with this on the server side. So be it. But again, just a different way to interact with the world. Okay, where are we here? Yeah. Sorry, just trying to time my lecture. As I talk about all this JavaScript stuff, maybe I do want to take a step back here and say, well, like I said, like way back at the beginning here, I did say something like, well, what if? Like, what if the code doesn't run or doesn't run exactly the way you expect? I think this is something you should worry about as a web programmer. How does, if somebody uses curl to access data, or has a maybe not even smartphone browser, like they have some janky old Nokia phone because they like it, or it's what's available locally to them, or whatever it is, I think it matters how your site behaves in those contexts. And the web, and part of the reason I like it, this is how the web was built. Like, it was built with this in mind, that we have a language for content and a language for appearance and a language for behavior, and they're separate. And if a user agent is interested in just one of them, it can load just one of them. I think sites should be usable or understandable at least, if somebody only loads the HTML and doesn't load the JavaScript. That, again, I will admit quite freely, puts me out of step with the way web development is done in the modern world. But I like the HTML, CSS, JavaScript structure. I think it's well designed. So if you rely on JavaScript for everything because all of your content is built client-side with one of the JavaScript frameworks, maybe that's not ideal. So again, I like this structure. And again, I think, oh God, my lectures are blurring together. But I did mention a week or two ago, what's my favorite client-side framework? Probably no client-side framework, because I can get my content in HTML and I get my style in a CSS file, and I don't need to build all of those things dynamically on the client. There are things that you can do with JavaScript that make a great deal of sense. I don't think putting all of your content together with it are maybe the thing to do, but so be it. If you have a client-side framework, sure. Perhaps an example of this progressive enhancement that the web is designed with. Like, at some point, I believe HTML5 introduced the input type date, but with knowledge that, okay, new browsers don't understand input type equals date, which is that enough? Yeah, right. So that is by itself a date picker, and that's really cool in browsers that support it. Which is most browsers. But in the browsers that don't support it, well, this was always the rule, that if the browser doesn't know the input type, it should fall back to text. So, okay, in a modern browser, this will work as a date input. On a non-modern browser, it will be just a text input, and somebody has to enter a date just by typing the date. Okay, so they don't get the shiny, this beautiful user interface. You lose a little bit of that data validation on the client side, but you had to validate the data on the server side anyway, because otherwise you have no reason to think you have coherent data. That's just nice design, just technically good design. If you have this living system where, again, there's old web browsers and new web browsers, again, well done. And just, again, the whole design of everything is with this idea in mind. So don't forget this, I guess. Like, even if you are working with a full-on JavaScript client-side framework, well, what happens in different web browsers? What happens on a smaller screen? What happens if somebody's connection is really slow? Like, I think all of those things are situations that are realistic. I don't know what. I don't know. Can I use Flexbox? Again, probably. Can I use like, I want a JavaScript? Okay. Can I use just like reasonably modern JavaScript? Mostly. With, again, okay, weak map, for example, maybe I can't use, or whatever, or I can use an IE11. I think this is worth thinking about. And again, I think we're thinking about more than most web developers do in the current world. It's better than it was 5 or 10 years ago, but still, there are differences that you should worry about and should be aware of. So again, my old man yells at cloud web development. I think of JavaScript as an enhancement to pages that already work. You have a framework on the front end, that's fine, but consider not. I've been thinking about revising this course to pair with the front end course that Bobby has been teaching, and I thought about putting together a sequence of exercises. I think it's impossible, but I think it'd be really cool. That's just like step 1, get your backend framework working. Step 2, render HTML and send it to the user. Step 3, create a REST API. Step 4, create a front end framework that consumes a REST API, just to create that side by side of how many lines of code is it to do either one? How big a pain in the ass is it to do either one? It would be a lot. It would be a big chunk of weekly exercises in the course to do that, but I think it would make my point. Anyway. So I think this idea of progressive enhancement or graceful degradation, maybe it's also the right way to think about mobile web, which I will talk about later today as well. Start with one and then move to the other. And I don't know, like, whether you want to think about desktop first or mobile first, I don't really care. I think either one is fine, but it's probably, you're going to worry about one of them first, and then, well, how do we enhance or how do we degrade, whichever way you want to think about it, to the other scenario? Okay, so moving on to JavaScript frameworks, which we heard about during the technology evaluation. Let's bring that list of topics up again. So at this point, I guess maybe I move back to JavaScript is just a programming language. It's imperfect, like all programming languages. There are common problems that developers have that are not built into the language, or that are not solved by anything built into the language, just like every other programming language. So you get this collection of tools that solve problems that people have. And somehow, if they're small, we call them libraries, and if they're big, we call them frameworks. The JavaScript ecosystem is huge. We heard about a few things during the technology evaluation presentations. Let's see if I can make any sense of them in the broader, like in a broader categorization. So I'm gonna call jQuery just the like things that should have been in the language but weren't. It's, again, do you need jQuery? Maybe not. For modern JavaScript, it's certainly very commonly used, but I don't know, just things like form manipulation. You can do it with a plain JavaScript, obviously, like jQuery itself is written in plain JavaScript, but the API is a little clunky, and wouldn't it be nice if we could just, well, yeah, there's a function for that in jQuery. Moving sort of on from there, there's a million specialized tools for various client-side and server-side things. Like Reveal.js is what's running the slides that you're looking at here. Okay, there's JavaScript behavior for, like, when I press the left and right arrow, I flip slides, and whatever else Reveal.js does. All of these, like, data visualization things and whatever else, fine. These are just sort of normal libraries in the normal programming library sense. Let's get to the frameworks, which are, I think, probably the more interesting topic. They're the thing that is more unique to client-side JavaScript, like the way these frameworks work and the problem they're solving. Again, I think I stand by this characterization. If you are writing JavaScript code and you sometimes forget that it's JavaScript, and you forgot that it was JavaScript, you thought you were writing React, okay, it's a framework. If it's so big that again, almost every line of code uses it, I would probably call it a framework. As far as I can tell, from a descriptivist point of view, that seems to be what people mean when they say framework. So the sort of the pieces that the JavaScript frameworks generally try to address is some subset of, like, this chain, right? So I have a REST API or what's it called? GraphQL API. Thank you, Group 1. Yeah, you have an API on the server. Okay, so that's the server's problem. So we're thinking about the client side here. What we need to do is get data from the server to the user. So there's the first step is like make that HTTP request, deal with the JSON data, or maybe the user is entering data or clicking stuff, causing data to be generated on the client side. We need to send it back towards the server. That's why this is a double-ended arrow. So one way or another, we have the data structure represented as JSON, and we have to get it over the wire. And then this next step, which again can go either way, we have an object in the programming language. It has to be sent to the server, or the server sent us JSON. It has to be turned into a useful object that we can work with in the client. And then we have to actually show it to the user, or the user does something and we have to turn that into an object, probably so it can be sent back towards the server and stored in the database or whatever. So different frameworks handle different parts of that chain. I wish I had a more general thing to say here. I'll do my best, I guess, to categorize these. This end of the chain, the sort of talking to the server end of the chain, this is not where it's not where the cool front-end frameworks are living right now. Which is really an annoyance of mine. Like if I come over here to one of these lists, like, okay, React is a front-end framework, React and Angular and Vue being the big front-end frameworks, I don't think any of them live in this space. They all are straight up, I have data, I want to show it to the user and deal with user actions. And it really has been an annoyance of mine. Like, it's like, okay, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write some Vue, I'm going to do some React. Where's my data? Like, okay, I still have all of this problem left of how do I get data into the programming language so I can actually start working with it. Some of the frameworks do this. There are, of course, separate plugins for React and Angular and stuff that will hit some of these parts of the chain of I need to make a request to a REST API and get the data and turn it into an object and then pass it up the chain towards the user, or the other direction, one way or the other. Again, I have data in the programming language and I want to show it to the user. This seems to be what's getting it more attention in the front end space. And that's, again, the big modern frameworks. But again, not being an expert in all of these frameworks, it's like, which direction of arrow do they actually handle? If there has been a user action and I want to take what they entered into the form and turn it into a new contact object, can I do that within the framework, or do I have to somehow step back, write some code that generates the object and then triggers a send back to the server? As far as I can tell with like React and Vue, the answer is they don't do that for you. You have to take the thing the user did and write some code to, or use some other tool to send it back. Angular does have this, what do they say, two-way data binding, where again, user does something, we can send it back. We can at least create an object out of it and then maybe send it back towards the server. The object towards the user, this is fundamentally a question of template rendering. It's, I have data, here's how I want the data to be turned into HTML, go. Put the data into the HTML and get it in front of the user's eyeballs in the browser. When you're doing this, and again, it's another annoyance of mine with these frameworks, if I have data and I'm displaying it to the user, that's content. Content on the web is a resource. Resources on the web have a URL. How do I get my data to have a URL if I have a single page app? And this is, again, it is something the frameworks will deal with. There are these like URL features or plugins or whatever in all the front end frameworks, but I think data should have a usable URL, right? I should be able to, if I'm looking at a piece of content, I should be able to take this, copy it, paste it, and find that content again. That's how the web works. I need that piece as well of content should be, a URL should somehow be linked to that display, if at all possible. It means writing more code and configuring that and setting it up. So I oversimplified everything there, right? That was, again, very terse introduction to the front-end frameworks. Well, what else did we hear about? Okay, so React, Vue, oh God, is Next.js is server side? Yeah. Express is server side, Angular is front end. It's an interesting, like, again, I'm always interested in the collection of topics people choose. These, like, again, these are reasonably recent lists of like frameworks in JavaScript that people like, or think are popular or whatever. Like, we didn't hear about Ember, did we? No. Yeah, we didn't hear about Ember this semester. It seems cool. I think, if I'm remembering right, is it the one? Yeah, like, well, I guess if you plug in Ember data, it really is the full, again, API through to the user experience, which is really cool, but it doesn't seem to have caught on. Like, it doesn't seem to be as popular or as broadly talked about as React or something. And I haven't used all of these things enough to know why. It's still on the list. Aurelia JS is client side. Yeah, relatively new, relatively, like, I don't know if I've ever had a presentation on it in the course. Like, it's not widely thought of. Maybe it's awesome. Maybe people should be using it. I don't know. Meteor, I think, is both server side and client side. Anyway, like, these frameworks are certainly really interesting, and even just from a like perspective of what do you do as a JavaScript developer, how are these designed, what are they designed for, is really interesting. And I wish I had infinite time to use them all and really get my head around them, but geez, there's only so many hours in the day. Hopefully your classmates helped a little bit on that one. Again, there's so many that even with 21 groups here, it's still just a sampling. So the other thing that we heard about back here were some server side, again, Next and Express being in this category. So, okay, JavaScript, I mean, we can have an argument about whether or not JavaScript is a nicely designed language, but it's not bad. Considering how long Brendan and I had to design it, it's very well designed. It was designed very, very quickly. It's an okay programming language. Like, I'm not radically opposed to it. The just-in-time compiler crowd has really like worked hard on making JavaScript run fast. Because, again, it was the only language supported by web browsers. So you want your web browser to run JavaScript faster than your competitor's web browser. That makes it better. So there's a huge amount of work on how can we make JavaScript run fast in ways that I would not have predicted were possible 10 or 15 years ago. So, okay, you can take that same tool chain, pull it out, and run it on its own. Okay, so JavaScript runs pretty fast. You already know JavaScript, or if you're doing much web development, you're going to know it pretty soon. Okay, so it has a lot going for it. So why don't we use it on the server? We need a programming language on the server side. Why not have one programming language that's end-to-end? One developer can work across the whole stack if they need to. You can share logic across the whole stack, right? If you have code for something like validating a date or something, you can have the date validation code run in the front end, but you can have the exact same thing run in the back end, because you do have to validate there, of course. All of that sounds really cool. That sounds like a great idea. Unless, like, I think, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Rails will, at least in some limited way, take the field validators on either models or forms, and it will somehow magic them into some JavaScript code, I thought. That's cool, but it's probably not 100% awesome. It's not going to do everything in the world. Maybe I just want to write my validation function once, and I'll write it in JavaScript, and I'll run it in both sides. That'd be cool. Okay, I was right a few slides ago in my memory that Meteor does the whole thing. That Meteor will, like, both talk to your database on the server side and build HTML on the client side, I think, and then communicate between the two. I don't know why Meteor hasn't caught on. Like, that seems really nice, doesn't it? To be able to just have one sort of more unified code base from, again, all the way from the database to the user's eyeballs. But it hasn't. And again, I don't know why. Maybe it promises a lot and it's just a nightmare to work with. I'm not sure. At the same time, again, I think me, the Compute 383 instructor, here is like, well, but I could choose any programming language on the client, on the server. Like, I have to choose JavaScript on the client side. I get to choose any language I want on the server side. You know, what do I write Erlang? We did hear about, Chicago, anyway, whatever. It's Erlang or Elixir, one of the two. Maybe I would rather write that. Like, that seems like a really cool framework and a really cool tool chain. I don't love JavaScript. It's not the programming language I would choose over all others. I don't know. I don't know which one is better. Like, and I certainly be interesting. Like, I wish I could do some kind of like long-term comparison of like projects in this course of like, is it better to use a front-end framework? Is it better to use JavaScript on the back end? Who produces better projects on average at the end? I don't know. I don't think the data is there. I would need thousands of groups to really figure it out. But that's what I'm going to say about JavaScript and the front end. So I think that's a good time to take a break. I do have some more stuff to say, but for the moment, I'll leave that. We'll come back in a few minutes and talk about mobile web. See you then.